A routine forest clearing turned into pure shock. A logger cut open a massive fallen tree and decided to look inside. But what he saw there changed his life forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm had rolled through the mountains of Oregon like a living creature, tearing branches from their trunks, pushing centuries-old trees to the ground with a force that seemed almost deliberate. For hours, the winds had screamed through the valleys and ridges, flattening everything in their path, while sheets of rain hammered the soil until it turned soft and black. When the storm finally moved on, it left the forest changed, as if a giant hand had come down from the sky and rearranged the land without care for what it destroyed. Jaden Holloway stood at the edge of the cleared logging road the following morning, staring into the dense wall of broken timber ahead of him. He had seen storms before, had worked through their aftermath many times during his career, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the sheer number of downed trees blocking the trail, or the silence that followed, an uncanny quiet, broken only by the drip of rainwater falling from shattered branches. Whatever it was, Jaden felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. He was a big man, his shoulders broad from decades of swinging axes and handling chainsaws, his hands calloused and stained with resin that no soap could wash away. At 42 years old, he had spent most of his life working these forests, just like his father and grandfather before him. The Holloways were known in the region as reliable men of the woods, people who could be counted on when roads were blocked, when mills needed supplies, when storms left chaos behind. Jaden had inherited not just their strength, but also their deep respect for the forest. To him, the trees were more than lumber. They were history, shelter, and memory. This morning, though, he looked at them as obstacles. The county had called his crew in to reopen the road that wound through the forest toward several small communities higher in the mountains. Families relied on that road for everything: groceries, school buses, emergency vehicles. With it blocked, they were cut off, and time was running short. Jaden and the other loggers had their orders: cut, clear, and make it passable again. It was back-breaking work, but work he knew well, and he welcomed it the way a craftsman welcomes a familiar tool in his hand. The air was heavy with moisture, the ground soft under his boots. Piles of branches and leaves were scattered like a battlefield. He started his chainsaw, the roar cutting through the stillness, and moved to the first fallen trunk. Piece by piece, he sliced away the obstruction, working with a practiced rhythm that came from years of repetition. The sound of chainsaws echoed in the distance, his crew members working along different parts of the road. Birds had not yet returned after the storm, and the forest felt oddly vacant, as though every living thing was holding its breath. After an hour, Jaden paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead. The air was cool, but the labor was exhausting, and his muscles burned from the effort. He glanced around at the devastation, noting the way some trees had splintered in half, while others had been ripped from the ground entirely, roots jutting upward like claws. Among the wreckage, one tree in particular caught his eye. It was massive, older than most of the others, lying diagonally across a ditch. Its bark was cracked and weathered, but it wasn't the size or the age that drew him closer. It was the sound it made when the storm had knocked it down. He remembered it clearly. The hollow thud, different from the deep, solid crash of the other trunks. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the fatigue of the long day making him hear things differently. But now, standing before the fallen giant, he struck the side lightly with the back of his axe, and the sound confirmed his suspicion. It echoed strangely, like rapping on an empty barrel. Curiosity sparked in him. He stepped onto the trunk and walked carefully along its length, his boots leaving muddy prints. The surface was firm enough, but it felt lighter than it should have been for a tree this size. Kneeling, he brushed away loose bark with his hand, revealing jagged cracks that seemed to run deeper than usual. He leaned closer, peering into one of the wider splits, and was met with darkness. The interior looked different, not like the fibrous wood he expected, but like a void. Jaden frowned. He had seen hollow trees before. Disease, insects, and fire could eat away at the heartwood while leaving the outer shell intact. But this one was different. The cavity seemed to stretch farther than it should, and the edges of the split were oddly smooth, as if something had scraped or worn them down. He pressed his hand against the bark. It felt brittle, fragile in a way that didn't match the tree's outward strength. He told himself to keep working, to ignore the strange curiosity gnawing at him. The county was paying for cleared roads, not for him to play detective. Still, the thought lingered. A hollow tree of this size could be dangerous. If it had been standing before the storm, it might have fallen on someone without warning. That was reason enough to investigate. And, if he was honest with himself, he wanted to understand. This was his forest, his responsibility, and he couldn't walk away from something that didn't make sense. He switched off his chainsaw, letting the silence return, and crouched beside the split once more. His flashlight was clipped to his belt, so he pulled it free and clicked it on. The beam cut into the darkness inside, illuminating the interior walls of the trunk. His breath caught in his throat. The wood inside was almost entirely gone. The tree had become a shell, its thick bark the only thing holding its shape. Where solid heartwood should have been, there was nothing but empty space and crumbling dust. It didn't look natural. The cavity wasn't rough and uneven as decay usually left it. Instead, the interior walls were smooth, strangely uniform. He swept the light along the length of the hollow, noting how far it stretched. It was like a tunnel carved through the center of the trunk, widening in some areas, narrowing in others, but always too perfect, too deliberate. He leaned back, unsettled. The storm had knocked down hundreds of trees, but this one was different. It was like the forest itself had presented him with a riddle. He tried to recall if he had ever encountered something similar. He thought of the carpenter ants that sometimes hollowed out logs, or of fungal infections that rotted trees from the inside out. But those left clear signs: frass, nests, spores, discoloration. This tree had none of those. It was simply empty. The sound of another chainsaw in the distance reminded him he wasn't alone. His crew was working, expecting him to do the same. He exhaled slowly, pushing away the unease, and stood up. He told himself he would finish clearing the road and come back later, maybe with better tools, maybe with someone from forestry services. Yet, even as he made that decision, he knew it wasn't true. He wouldn't be able to leave it alone. The image of that hollow interior would follow him, gnawing at his mind until he understood. For now, though, he tightened his gloves and restarted his chainsaw. The roar filled the clearing once again, drowning out the questions in his head. He forced himself to focus on the work in front of him, cutting and hauling, but his eyes kept drifting back to the hollow giant. He could almost feel it watching him, though he knew that was nonsense. Trees didn't watch. They didn't hide things. They simply grew, fell, and decayed. Still, as he worked through the morning, the thought remained: why had this one been empty inside? What had hollowed it out so cleanly, leaving nothing but a shell? And why did it feel, standing near it, as though he was on the edge of discovering something he wasn't meant to find? By the time the sun broke through the clouds, Jaden had cleared enough of the road to let a vehicle pass. His muscles ached, his back throbbed, but his gaze kept returning to that tree in the ditch. The storm had revealed something strange, something hidden in plain sight, and he knew with certainty that he would have to look deeper. As he gathered his tools and prepared to move farther down the road, he cast one last glance at the hollow trunk. The sunlight caught the cracks in its bark, throwing thin shadows across the surface. For just a moment, it looked like the lines of a map, leading somewhere unknown. Jaden shook his head, but the image stuck with him as he walked on. The storm had passed, but its legacy lingered, and in that silent forest, a mystery had just begun. The next morning, the forest was still damp from the storm, its floor soft with decaying leaves and broken branches. Jaden returned to the site where the massive hollow tree lay across the ditch. Sleep had not offered him peace. Throughout the night, his mind kept circling back to the image of that hollow interior, those smooth walls that seemed too precise to be the result of decay. He had told himself he would wait, focus on his work, and perhaps let someone from forestry look at it later. But when dawn came, he knew he could not leave it alone. There was something about that tree that demanded answers, and he felt compelled to find them. He walked the road slowly, boots squelching in the mud, the chainsaw hanging heavy at his side. The silence of the forest pressed on him again, broken only by the occasional rustle of water dripping from high branches. His crew had been assigned to a different section today, so he was alone in this stretch, and that solitude made the air feel heavier. He found the giant trunk just as he had left it, tilted slightly over the ditch, bark cracked and splintered from its fall. The hollow sound still lingered in his memory. Climbing onto the trunk, he tapped the surface again with the butt of his axe. The same strange echo answered him, hollow and unnatural. He crouched, pulling his gloves tight against his hands, and brushed more of the bark away. Underneath, the surface crumbled easily, like fragile pottery that had been baked too long in the sun. It flaked in his hands, breaking into powdery fragments that clung to his fingers. He frowned, unsettled by how fragile it was. A tree of this size should not be so delicate, even if hollow. Jaden shifted his weight and leaned closer, pressing his flashlight beam into a split that ran deep into the trunk. The light revealed once more the cavity inside, wide, empty, stretching farther than he could see from this angle. The interior walls caught his attention again. They weren't jagged or uneven as rot usually left them. Instead, they were unnervingly smooth, as though something had scraped them clean. He traced the edge with his gloved hand, feeling the unnatural evenness beneath his palm. He tried to explain it to himself. Carpenter ants sometimes hollowed logs, though not with this kind of precision. Certain fungi could consume heartwood, but they left signs: discoloration, residue, a distinct smell. Here there was only emptiness, a dry, powdery residue, and those smooth surfaces. His mind refused to accept it as ordinary. Something about it seemed deliberate. The more he examined it, the more questions formed. He thought of the countless trees he had cut in his career, how he could often predict what he would find inside before his saw even touched the bark. But this was different. He was staring at a mystery, and mysteries were not a part of his job. Still, he could not pull himself away. He felt a stubborn need to understand, to see it through. Steeling himself, he decided to widen the opening. He switched on his chainsaw, the roar startling in the silence, and began carefully cutting into the fractured section of bark. Sawdust flew into the air, though not the rich golden dust of fresh wood. This was lighter, grayer, almost like ash. The chainsaw cut easily, far too easily, and within minutes he had created a wider hole. He shut the machine off and peered inside once more. Now the opening was large enough for him to climb part way into the trunk. He leaned in, shining his flashlight deeper. The beam illuminated a tunnel that extended through the length of the tree. The inside was almost entirely gone, just a shell of bark and thin outer wood. He saw that the hollow widened in places, forming small alcoves or chambers, as though something had carved out separate spaces along the interior. They were too symmetrical to dismiss as random decay. He crawled a little farther in, one knee resting on the edge of the bark, and inspected the surface of one of these alcoves. The marks were clearer here. Long grooves ran along the wood, parallel to each other, as though scraped or cut by tools. He drew his hand along them, shivering as he realized they were too clean to be claw marks, too consistent to be from insects. Someone, or something, had worked the inside of this tree with purpose. The idea unsettled him deeply. Why would anyone carve out the inside of a tree like this? What possible use could it have? He thought of hunters, of poachers who sometimes hid equipment or contraband in the woods. He remembered hearing rumors of people using caves, abandoned sheds, even buried containers as storage, but never had he heard of anyone turning a tree into a hollow shell like this. It would take immense effort, and for what gain? He sat back, breathing heavily, his flashlight beam flickering across the interior walls. The silence in the hollow was oppressive, the air strangely stale. He felt as though he had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. For the first time, a hint of fear touched him. Not the primal fear of danger, but the quieter fear of the unknown. He was a man who thrived on certainty, on the tangible solidity of the forest. Here, that certainty was stripped away. He shook his head, trying to chase the feeling. Maybe he was exaggerating, letting fatigue and curiosity color his thoughts. Still, the facts remained. The tree was unnaturally hollow, the interior walls were unnaturally smooth, and the grooves looked deliberate. He could not explain it away so easily. He climbed down from the trunk, pacing around it slowly. From the outside, it appeared like any other fallen giant. Rough bark, moss clinging to its shaded side, splinters jutting from where it had cracked on impact. But knowing what lay inside changed everything. It was a shell, an empty husk, hiding its strangeness beneath an ordinary surface. The contrast unsettled him even more. As the day stretched on, Jaden found himself returning again and again to the hollow, examining it from different angles, each time hoping to find a simple explanation. None came. He thought of diseases, of natural processes, of every possibility he could recall from years of working the forest. But the more he looked, the less convinced he became. The tree was not just hollow. It was crafted, altered, transformed into something else entirely. By late afternoon, the light was dimming through the canopy. He knew he had wasted valuable hours that should have been spent clearing the road, but he could not tear himself away. He crouched once more at the opening, flashlight beam sliding over those smooth, carved surfaces, and accepted what his instincts had been telling him since the first hollow thud reached his ears. This tree was not just the product of storm and decay. Something had happened here, something intentional. And whatever the reason, he was now tangled in it, unable to walk away. He turned off his flashlight and sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the forest breathe around him. Tomorrow he would return, and tomorrow he would look deeper. The questions gnawed at him, and he knew he would not rest until he found an answer. The strange trunk had become more than a curiosity. It had become a puzzle, and Jaden Holloway was not a man who left puzzles unsolved. When Jaden returned to the hollow trunk the following day, the sky was clear, but the air still carried the damp chill of the storm. He had hardly slept again, his mind restless with the image of the tree's smooth interior. The questions that had followed him into the night had grown heavier, not lighter, and though he tried to reason with himself that there must be a simple explanation, the unease gnawing at him told another story. He walked slowly along the muddy track, his boots sinking into the soft ground, the silence of the forest pressing in around him as if even the birds had chosen not to return. The trunk lay just as he had left it, cracked open like a giant carcass, its insides yawning with emptiness. He set down his tools nearby and crouched beside the split again, brushing away fresh flakes of bark that had fallen loose overnight. The opening seemed wider now, or perhaps it was only his imagination, but the sight of it unsettled him in the same way as before. He clicked on his flashlight and leaned inside, determined to study it more closely, to find the answers he had failed to uncover yesterday. As the beam swept across the hollow, he saw details he had missed before. Long, parallel scratches ran down the length of the inner wall, stretching from one chamber-like alcove to another. At first glance, they looked like cracks, but when he traced one with his gloved finger, he realized it was deliberate, cut deep into the surface. The lines were too consistent, too uniform to be natural. They followed a path, almost like the grooves of a tool dragged repeatedly along the wood. His pulse quickened as he studied them more closely, his mind resisting what his eyes were telling him. He pulled his hand back and looked at his fingers. The tips were coated with fine dust, not like sawdust from his chainsaw, but lighter, almost powdery, as though the wood had been ground down carefully. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, watching the particles drift away in the breeze. It was not the product of decay. This was something different, something intentional. Jaden shifted to another section of the trunk, forcing his flashlight deeper into one of the hollowed alcoves. There, half buried in a pile of brittle fragments, something caught the light. He reached in and pulled out a short length of old rope, frayed and stiff with age. It crumbled at the ends where the fibers had rotted, but its presence was undeniable. His heart sank. Trees did not make rope. Someone had been here before him. Someone who had worked inside this hollow for reasons he could not yet understand. He set the rope aside carefully and continued searching. A few minutes later, he found more. Near another alcove was a scrap of cloth, wedged into a crevice as though forgotten or left behind. It was stained and torn, the color faded to something unrecognizable, but it was fabric, not forest matter. He turned it over in his hands, the dampness of the cloth clinging to his gloves, and his unease deepened. The tree was not just hollow, it had been used. Standing back, Jaden felt a chill despite the morning sun. The thought of someone crawling into this trunk, carving and scraping the interior into chambers, leaving behind rope and cloth, it unsettled him in ways he struggled to articulate. He imagined hunters using it as a hideout, or poachers storing equipment inside, protected from rain and hidden from sight. The more he thought about it, the more plausible it became. He knew these forests had long been plagued by people who ignored the law, who saw wildlife not as something to protect, but as profit to be harvested. Could this be one of their hiding places? He crouched again and pressed his hand against one of the grooves in the wall, following its line deeper into the hollow. He tried to picture how it had been made. A sharp blade, perhaps, or some kind of scraping tool, drawn repeatedly across the surface until the chamber was clean. The grooves were too straight to be the work of claws, too precise to be made by accident. It had been deliberate, purposeful. The idea brought with it a new kind of fear. If this was a hideout or a cache, then its owners might not be far. He was alone in this stretch of forest, and though he carried an axe and his chainsaw, he knew they were no defense against men determined to protect their secrets. The silence around him suddenly felt heavier, as though it was listening. He straightened, scanning the trees, every rustle of leaves making his heart race. Nothing moved, but the sense of being watched lingered all the same. Jaden forced himself to breathe steadily, telling himself he was letting his imagination run wild. Still, the evidence was undeniable. The rope, the cloth, the grooves. Someone had been here. Someone had turned this tree into something unnatural. He tried to imagine the purpose. Was it simply a storage space, a temporary shelter, or something more sinister? The forest was vast, and the storm had knocked down countless trees. Who knew how many others had been hollowed in the same way, hiding similar secrets? The weight of responsibility pressed on him. He had worked these woods his entire life, prided himself on knowing them better than most. But now he realized there were corners even he did not understand, secrets buried in trunks and shadows. The discovery unsettled him not just as a worker, but as a man tied to this land by family and history. It felt like a betrayal, as though the forest he loved had been used for purposes he could not condone. He stepped back from the tree and wiped his hands on his jeans, his gloves coated in dust and fragments. He looked again at the discarded rope and cloth, lying like forgotten relics at his feet. He could not ignore them. They were proof, evidence of something larger than decay or chance. And though every instinct told him to leave, to pretend he had never seen them, he knew he could not. He had stumbled onto something, and whether he liked it or not, he was now part of it. The day passed in a blur of conflicted thoughts. He tried to continue with his work, cutting other trunks, clearing the road, but his eyes kept drifting back to the hollow giant. Each time he saw it, he remembered the grooves under his fingers, the dust on his gloves, the rope crumbling in his hands. He could not escape it. By the time the sun began to set, painting the forest in gold and shadow, he had accepted what he had been resisting all day. This was no ordinary tree. This was no ordinary hollow. He had found traces of human interference, and whatever their purpose, they carried with them a story he was not yet prepared to hear. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to decide what he would do next. He gathered his tools and started the long walk back down the road, the weight of the discovery heavy on his shoulders. The forest was quiet, but in his mind the echoes of the hollow trunk followed him, whispering questions he could not yet answer. He knew one thing with certainty. He would return. He would look deeper, because now there was no turning back. The strange trunk had revealed its first secrets, and he could feel there were more waiting in the shadows of its hollow heart. Jaden could not stop thinking about the rope and the scrap of cloth he had pulled from the hollow. The images followed him through the night, lingering in the corners of his mind like shadows that refused to fade. He tried to convince himself that they were simply remnants left behind by chance, perhaps discarded by campers or hunters long ago, but the deliberate grooves inside the trunk told a different story. Someone had done more than leave trash. Someone had worked to shape the interior of that tree, and the thought gnawed at him relentlessly. By the time dawn broke, he knew he had no choice but to go back. The forest seemed quieter than usual that morning, as though the birds themselves were wary of breaking the silence. The storm had stripped many branches bare, and shafts of sunlight reached the ground in odd patterns, throwing long streaks of gold across the muddy road. Jaden walked steadily, his breath forming faint clouds in the cool air, his mind replaying every detail of what he had seen the day before. He carried only his axe and flashlight this time. The chainsaw felt unnecessary. He wasn't here to work, not really. He was here to uncover whatever else the hollow tree was hiding. When he reached the massive trunk, it looked unchanged, as if it had been waiting for him. The bark was dark with moisture, cracks stretching like veins across its surface. He crouched by the split again, hands pressed to the rough exterior, and felt a strange familiarity, as though he were returning to a place that now belonged to him as much as to the forest. Switching on his flashlight, he leaned inside, the beam illuminating the carved chambers once more. At first, nothing looked different. The grooves were still there, the powdery dust still clinging to the walls, but as he swept the light deeper into the alcoves, something caught his eye. Near the far end of one hollow, tucked partially beneath a collapsed section of bark, was a dull metallic glint. His pulse quickened. He crawled part way into the trunk, his body scraping against the brittle edges, and reached into the narrow space. His fingers closed around a small, cold object, and he pulled it free. It was a can, rusted and dented, its lid corroded but intact. He turned it in his hands, flakes of rust fallen onto the ground below. Whatever label it had once borne was long gone, eaten away by time and dampness. He shook it gently, and something rattled inside, a dry, shifting sound that made him pause. The weight was uneven, suggesting it wasn't empty. He frowned, unsure if he wanted to know what it held, and for a long moment he just stared at it, his heart pounding with the realization that this was no accident. Setting the can carefully aside, he pushed deeper into the trunk, ignoring the way the bark groaned under his weight. The hollow widened slightly, enough for him to crouch and shine his light into another alcove. There, wedged tightly between the smooth inner walls, was another object. This one was rectangular, its corners catching the light. He reached out cautiously and tugged until it came free, his breath catching when he realized what it was. A box. Small, metal, its surface mottled with corrosion but still solid. It fit in his hands like something meant to be carried, meant to be hidden. His fingers traced the seam along its edge, the faint outline of a clasp still visible though rusted shut. He tried to pry it open, but the metal resisted, refusing to yield to his efforts. He held it close to his flashlight, studying it carefully. This was no piece of trash left behind by chance. Someone had placed it here deliberately, hidden it inside this hollow with intention. Jaden sat back on his heels, the box heavy in his lap, and felt a wave of unease roll through him. This was proof. Tangible, undeniable, that the tree had been used as a hiding place, and not just once. The rope, the cloth, the can, and now this box, each item layered like fragments of a story left for him to uncover. He tried to imagine who had done this. Poachers seemed the most likely answer. He had heard enough tales of illegal hunters in these woods, men who set traps and used cruel methods to capture bears, elk, even protected birds. They knew the forest as well as he did, and they would have needed places to conceal their tools and loot. A hollow tree would have been perfect, out of sight, protected from the weather, unremarkable to anyone passing by. But the box troubled him. The can and the rope could have been explained as supplies, tools of the trade, but a metal box suggested something else, something more deliberate. Documents, money, or even weapons. He felt a chill as the possibilities crossed his mind. If this was tied to poaching, then he'd uncovered more than a curiosity. He had uncovered evidence. He carried the box out of the trunk and set it on the ground beside the can, both objects sitting like accusations in the mud. He stared at them for a long time, wrestling with what to do next. He could try to break the box open, but a part of him resisted. It felt wrong to tamper with it, as though he would be destroying something that didn't belong to him. Another part of him whispered that it could be dangerous, that whoever had hidden it might not take kindly to him prying into their secrets. The thought unsettled him deeply. He was alone out here, surrounded by miles of silent forest. If the people who had used this tree were still active in the area, they might not appreciate someone uncovering their work. The sense of being watched returned, prickling at the back of his neck, and he scanned the trees around him, heart thudding in his chest. Nothing moved, but the silence felt heavier, like a warning. He crouched again, running his hands over the box one more time. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Not now. The discovery was too important, too dangerous to ignore. The responsible thing would be to contact the authorities, to let them handle it. But doing so meant admitting he had spent hours poking around in a place he should have left alone. It meant stepping into a situation that might spiral far beyond his control. Jaden sat in the mud, the weight of the box in his hands, and thought of his father, who had taught him to respect the forest and all that lived within it. His father had always said that the woods held secrets, and that a man's duty was to honor them, not exploit them. Now, staring at the proof of exploitation before him, Jaden felt a surge of anger. Someone had twisted this tree into a hiding place, had scarred it with grooves, and filled it with objects that spoke of greed and disregard. He couldn't ignore that. As the sun climbed higher, sending shards of light through the canopy, Jaden made his decision. He would not pry the box open here, and he would not carry it home like a prize. He would call for help, for professionals who could handle whatever secrets it contained. It wasn't fear that guided him, but responsibility. The forest deserved better than silence, and he knew he had stumbled onto something that demanded to be brought into the light. Still, as he packed up his tools and prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the unease that clung to him. The box remained on the ground beside the can, waiting for the next step, and the hollow tree loomed above like a sentinel. He glanced back once more before turning down the road, the image of the smooth, carved chambers etched permanently in his mind. He had uncovered the first pieces of a hidden story, but he could feel that it was only the beginning. The forest was holding its breath again, and Jaden knew he had crossed a threshold. Whatever lay ahead, it would not let him turn back now. The weight of the box and the rusted can haunted Jaden as he walked back to his truck. He had left them resting on the damp ground beside the hollow trunk, unable to bring himself to carry them away. But the memory of their presence clung to him as though they were strapped to his back. All through the evening and into the night, he replayed the images in his mind. The grooves etched too deliberately into the wood, the frayed rope, the faded scrap of cloth, and finally the sealed metal box that seemed to radiate secrecy. It was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was something larger, something that carried implications beyond his own understanding. By the time he sat at his kitchen table, staring at his silent phone, he realized that his hesitation had become unbearable. He could not keep this discovery to himself any longer. Morning came, and with it a renewed sense of urgency. Jaden rose early, his body heavy from a restless night, and returned to the forest. He needed to be sure, to see the tree once more with fresh eyes before he involved anyone else. The woods greeted him with the same unnatural stillness. Sunlight filtered weakly through gaps in the canopy, revealing a thin mist that hovered close to the ground. Each step seemed to echo more than it should, the silence amplifying the sound of his boots pressing into wet earth. When he reached the hollow trunk, it was as he had left it, collapsed, empty, its insides yawning with impossible hollowness. The box and the can sat waiting like silent judges at its base. For a moment, he stood staring at them, torn between the instinct to pick them up and the need to keep them untouched. He crouched and brushed away leaves that had settled overnight, studying them as though he might discover something new. But they remained what they had been. Proof that this tree had been used for a purpose beyond nature. Jaden's breath came slow and heavy as he pulled his phone from his pocket. The decision he was about to make would bring strangers into his forest, men and women who would pick apart the secrets he had uncovered. But it was the right choice. He had no claim to keep them hidden, and, more importantly, he could no longer bear the thought of what it would mean if he turned away. With a final glance around the still woods, he pressed the numbers for 911. The line clicked, and a calm voice answered, asking for the nature of the emergency. Jaden's words came carefully, almost reluctantly at first. He explained that he had been working in the forest clearing storm damage when he discovered something unusual in a fallen tree. The dispatcher asked him to clarify, and he felt his throat tighten as he said the words out loud, that the tree was hollowed unnaturally, that there were items inside, and that one of them was a locked metal box. For a moment there was silence on the other end. Then the dispatcher's tone sharpened with interest. She asked questions, pressing for details, and Jaden did his best to answer without letting his unease bleed into his voice. When the call ended, he stood for a long time with the phone still in his hand. The forest seemed to press closer around him, the branches creaking softly overhead as though they had overheard his confession. Now others would come, and the quiet mystery he had held alone for days would no longer be his. Relief and dread mingled in his chest. He had done the responsible thing, but the thought of uniformed men walking through the woods, trampling the ground, touching the hollow trunk, made him feel as though something sacred had been broken. He sank down onto the log beside the ditch, staring at the box and can as though they might vanish before anyone arrived. The minutes stretched into hours, the waiting gnawing at him more fiercely than the discovery itself. Every snap of a twig in the distance made him lift his head sharply. Every rustle of wind through the leaves sounded like footsteps. He imagined shadowy figures watching from deeper in the woods, the kind of men who might have used the tree as a cache, waiting for him to leave so they could reclaim what was theirs. The thought sent a shiver up his spine, and he found himself gripping the handle of his axe tighter. The forest, usually a place of familiarity and comfort, had become foreign, hostile even. The stillness was no longer peaceful, but suffocating, each moment of silence filled with the echo of his own doubts. He questioned whether calling had been a mistake, whether he had just invited danger into his life. Perhaps he should have left the items where they were, never touched them, never told a soul. But even as those thoughts clawed at him, he knew it was too late. The call had been made, and soon others would come to see what he had seen. As the day wore on, clouds thickened overhead, casting the forest in a muted gray light. Jaden's unease deepened with the shift in shadows, and he began to pace around the trunk. He studied the grooves again, running his hands over the unnatural lines cut into the wood, and felt the same dread return. These were not random, not accidental. They spoke of intent, of work carried out with patience and precision. They spoke of people who had reason to hide their actions. The tree had been turned into a vault, a secret hidden in plain sight, and he had stumbled upon it like an intruder. His thoughts spiraled as the waiting dragged on. He imagined men with rifles stepping silently between the trees, watching him even now. He imagined voices in the distance, the crack of a branch underfoot, the sudden rush of realization that he was not alone. Each time he glanced around, the forest revealed nothing but emptiness, yet his nerves refused to calm. The air felt heavier with each passing moment, the stillness sharpening into something almost unbearable. Finally, faint in the distance, he heard the hum of an approaching engine. Relief and anxiety surged together in his chest. Help was coming, but with it came the end of his solitude in this discovery. The sound grew louder, the crunch of tires against the wet road carrying through the trees, and soon he could make out the faint flash of lights weaving between the trunks. He stood, his grip tight on his axe, and waited as the vehicles drew closer. The forest seemed to exhale as the sound of the engines filled it, breaking the suffocating silence. Jaden knew the moment he had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure had finally arrived. The secrets of the hollow tree were no longer his alone. Whatever story it held would soon be exposed, and the quiet road of his days in the forest had been irrevocably changed. The rumble of engines grew louder until it seemed to shake the air itself. Jaden stood near the hollow trunk, his pulse quickening with each passing second, torn between relief and a strange sense of loss. He had carried this secret alone for days, walked the line between fear and fascination, and now that others were about to see what he had seen, he felt stripped of something private. Still, as the first vehicle pulled into view, a dark green pickup bearing the markings of the county sheriff's office, a wave of reassurance washed over him. He was no longer alone in this. The truck rolled to a stop, tires crunching over gravel and mud, followed closely by another vehicle from the State Forestry Service. The sight of the uniforms climbing out eased his nerves slightly, though the tension in his shoulders refused to fade. Two deputies approached, one older with a stern face carved by years of work, the other younger, eyes sharp and watchful. Behind them, a pair of forestry officers carried equipment: cameras, gloves, evidence bags. They looked around, their boots sinking into the damp ground, the silence of the forest broken now by the murmur of voices and the distant ticking of cooling engines. "You the one who called this in?" the older deputy asked, his tone calm but direct. Jaden nodded, clearing his throat. "Yes, I'm the one." His voice sounded rough in his own ears, as if unused to speaking after so much silence. "Show us what you found," the deputy said, gesturing toward the fallen tree. Jaden led them to the hollow trunk, pointing out the split where he had crawled inside. He tried to explain, without letting his unease color his words, describing how the interior was unnaturally smooth, how he had discovered rope, cloth, the rusted can, and finally the metal box. As he spoke, the younger deputy crouched by the opening, shining his flashlight inside, while the forestry officers circled, studying the exterior. One of the officers ran his gloved hand along the bark and whistled softly. "This isn't natural decay. Someone's worked this tree. You can see the marks plain as day." The younger deputy backed out of the hollow, nodding. "He's right. This isn't just rot. Looks carved." The older deputy glanced at Jaden, his expression unreadable. And the items? Jaden pointed to where he had placed the can and the box on the ground. They had remained there untouched since his last visit, streaked with moisture, rust gleaming faintly in the dim light. The deputy crouched, studying them carefully before motioning for the evidence bags. One of the forestry officers slid the can inside a bag with practiced care, while the other set about photographing the box from every angle before sealing it as well. "Looks like a cache," the deputy muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Could be hunters, maybe poachers, could be something worse." He straightened and fixed his gaze on Jaden. "You did the right thing calling this in." Jaden exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest loosening by a fraction. "I wasn't sure if I should," he admitted, "but it didn't feel right to keep quiet." The deputy gave a small nod, his eyes scanning the forest around them. "No, you were right. These woods have been on our radar for a while. Reports of illegal hunting, traps found where they shouldn't be, nothing we could pin down. Maybe this changes that." The forestry officers moved with quiet efficiency, documenting the hollow from every angle. One of them crawled partway inside, his flashlight beam dancing across the carved walls before backing out with a grim expression. "It's big enough to store equipment, even weapons," he said, "and the way it's cut, this took time. Someone planned this." The thought sent another ripple of unease through Jaden. He imagined shadowy figures laboring inside the trunk, scraping the wood away, shaping the chambers, hiding their tools in the belly of the tree. He shivered despite the warmth of the day. The younger deputy lifted the sealed box, testing its weight. "Whatever's in here, it's been sitting for a while. Rusted shut, but intact. Could be ammunition, maybe documents. We'll have to open it back at the station." The older deputy shot him a look, then turned back to Jaden. "You find anything else? Any signs of people nearby?" Jaden shook his head. "Just the rope and cloth. No footprints, no camps, nothing recent that I could tell." "Still," the deputy said, his tone measured, "if this tree was being used, there could be more like it. People don't go to this much trouble for just one spot." He glanced toward the forestry officers. "We'll have to sweep the area, check for others." The words settled heavy in Jaden's chest. He thought of all the trees scattered through the forest, countless trunks stretching for miles. How many might hide the same secret? The idea that the woods he had known all his life could be riddled with hidden caches unsettled him deeply. As the officers continued their work, Jaden stood to the side, feeling like a stranger in his own world. The forest that had once been his domain now belonged to the eyes of the law, dissected and catalogued. He told himself it was for the best, that justice required their presence, but the sight of gloves and cameras picking apart the hollow stirred something in him, a sense of intrusion. The tree had been a mystery, yes, but it had been his mystery. Now it was evidence. The older deputy approached him once more. "We'll take it from here. You can head back if you want, but I'll need your statement later at the station." Jaden nodded, though his feet felt rooted to the ground. He looked once more at the hollow trunk, its insides exposed to the harsh glare of flashlights, and felt an ache he couldn't quite name. It was as if the forest itself had been violated, its secret stripped bare. Yet beneath that ache was another feeling, quieter but insistent. Relief. Relief that he no longer carried the burden alone. The engines of the vehicles growled to life again as the evidence was loaded carefully into the back. The deputies and forestry officers spoke in low tones, planning their next steps, their voices carrying the weight of official duty. Jaden listened, half hearing words about sweeps, patrols, reports, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of the other trees, of the possibility that this was only the beginning. When they finally drove away, leaving the forest to its silence once more, Jaden stood alone beside the hollow trunk. The silence that returned was different now, heavier, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. He ran his hand along the bark one last time, feeling the brittle surface crumble under his touch, and wondered what other stories were hidden in the woods he thought he knew so well. The road behind him was clear enough to walk, the vehicle's tracks pressed deep into the mud. He followed them slowly, his axe swinging at his side, his thoughts restless. He had done the right thing. He had brought the secret into the light. But as he walked, one question echoed louder than the rest, refusing to leave him. How many more secrets waited, just out of sight, in the hollow hearts of other trees? The forest did not feel the same after the deputies and forestry officers left. The silence had returned, but it was no longer the silence Jaden had known all his life. It was heavier, almost resentful, as though the woods themselves had recognized that outsiders had walked among them, prying into their secrets. He lingered by the hollow trunk until the engines of the vehicles faded completely, his hand resting on the brittle bark, unsure whether he was saying farewell to it or apologizing. The tree was no longer his mystery. It belonged now to reports, photographs, and evidence bags, a specimen stripped of wonder and transformed into a piece of a criminal investigation. The following days blurred into one another. Jaden gave his statement at the sheriff's office, recounting every detail of what he had found. He described the grooves, the rope, the cloth, the can, and finally the box. He felt the weight of his own words as he spoke them, as if each syllable was prying him further away from the solitude he once shared with the tree. The deputies listened carefully, their pens scratching steadily, their expressions unreadable. When he left, he felt lighter, but only slightly, as though the burden had shifted from his shoulders to the pages of an official report. News traveled faster than he expected. Within a week, local papers carried the story, "Logger discovers hidden cache inside hollow tree in Oregon forest." The headline was splashed across front pages, accompanied by photographs of the rusted box and can, the hollowed interior of the trunk, and even a shot of Jaden himself, looking reluctant as he stood by the tree he had uncovered. The article speculated about illegal hunters and poachers, about secret networks hidden in the wilderness, and about what might still lie undiscovered among the thousands of acres of forest. Jaden read the words with a strange detachment, as if they described someone else. The mystery had gone public, and in doing so, it had lost its intimacy. Authorities soon announced that the items found inside the box were indeed linked to poaching activity. The contents, once pried open in the lab, included old ammunition, maps marked with circles deep within the forest, and a set of hunting tags that had long since expired. Each item was treated as a clue, a piece of a puzzle pointing to individuals who had used the forest not as a place of reverence, but as a hiding ground for their crimes. The sheriff's office confirmed that arrests had been made. Several men, suspected for years of illegal hunting and trafficking in animal parts, were taken into custody after the maps led investigators to other hidden sites. For Jaden, the revelation was both satisfying and unsettling. He was relieved to know his instincts had been right, that the tree had not lied to him, that its strange emptiness had indeed been the work of human hands. But the thought that poachers had carved their secrets into a place he considered almost sacred filled him with quiet anger. He had always believed the forest was a sanctuary, a place where life unfolded according to its own rhythm. To see it used as a vault for cruelty and greed shook his faith in that rhythm. Reporters tried to reach him, their voices leaving messages on his phone, their questions spilling into his mailbox. They wanted to know how he felt, what he thought, what he had seen. He ignored most of them. He was no storyteller, no man for headlines. He had only been doing his job, clearing fallen trees after a storm. The rest had unfolded because he could not look away from something strange, because he had listened to the unease in his chest instead of silencing it. That was all. But the world seemed to think he had uncovered something extraordinary. When he did finally agree to one interview, he spoke quietly, his words careful. "The forest tells you when something's wrong," he said. "You just have to be willing to listen." The journalist wrote it down as though it were a profound truth, but to Jaden it was simply the way he had been raised. His father had taught him that lesson when he was a boy, walking him through the woods, pointing out the signs others ignored. It was nothing mystical, just attention, respect, and patience. And yet, it had led him here, to a story that people across the county now read as though it were legend. In the weeks that followed, forestry officers swept the surrounding area. They found 2 more hollowed trunks, smaller but similar, each containing remnants of rope, tools, and traps. It became clear that the practice had not been a one-time occurrence, but part of a broader pattern. The forest had been used for years as a labyrinth of hiding places, each disguised as a simple fallen tree, each storing the implements of destruction. Jaden's discovery had been the first crack in the facade, the moment that let light into the shadows. Without it, the poachers might have continued unchecked. For Jaden, life returned gradually to its old rhythm. He worked again along the roads, cutting and clearing, the hum of the chainsaw steady in his ears. Yet nothing felt entirely the same. Each tree he cut carried with it a question. Was this one hollow too? Was it natural, or had someone once carved it open to serve as another hiding place? He found himself tapping trunks with the butt of his axe, listening for that hollow thud, searching for echoes that might reveal more secrets. The habit stayed with him, a quiet compulsion born from the discovery that had changed everything. Sometimes, late in the day, when the forest settled into its evening hush, he thought back to the moment he first tapped that massive trunk and heard the sound that had set everything in motion. He remembered the curiosity that had driven him to crawl inside, the unease that had swelled with every new finding, and the weight of the decision to call for help. He wondered what might have happened if he had walked away, if he had silenced that instinct and let the tree remain untouched. The thought unsettled him. Perhaps no one would have discovered the cache, and the poachers would have continued their work. Perhaps the forest itself had chosen him, though he would never say such a thing out loud. The hollow trunk eventually decayed further, its brittle shell collapsing into itself until only fragments remained. The Forestry Service marked the spot, but to Jaden it was no longer just a fallen tree. It was a reminder, a scar on the land that told the story of what had been hidden and what had been revealed. Each time he passed by, he paused for a moment, laying his hand on what little bark remained, and felt a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that he had done what was right, sorrow that such a thing had ever been necessary. And always, in the back of his mind, lingered the question that no investigation could fully answer. How many more secrets still lay hidden in the forest? How many more hollow trunks waited silently, their hearts carved away, holding within them the traces of human greed? It was a question he knew might never be answered, but it followed him with every step he took beneath the canopy, as constant as the smell of pine and the whisper of wind through the branches. In the end, Jaden accepted that the forest would always hold mysteries, some meant to be discovered, others meant to remain unseen. He had done his part, and though the story had taken on a life of its own, though it had been transformed into headlines and official reports, he knew the truth of it rested quietly in his memory. It was not the fame or the recognition that mattered, but the simple fact that he had listened when the forest told him something was wrong. And as he walked the trails again, axe in hand, listening for the hollow echoes in the trunks around him, he carried with him both a sense of vigilance and a renewed respect. The forest was not just his workplace. It was alive with stories, some written in leaves and roots, others carved into the hollow hearts of fallen trees. He had uncovered one such story, and though it had changed him, it had also reminded him of the bond he shared with the woods. That bond, stronger than any storm, would guide him for the rest of his days. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story. Click now to watch more shocking discoveries and true events that will leave you speechless. And if this video caught your attention, share it with your friends. Let them see it too.